Our guest today is Ken McQuiller. Ken is the CEO and founder of Nonprofit Missionary, a grant writing business that helps faith-based and community-centered organizations secure the funding they need to thrive. Based in Cleveland, Ohio, Ken describes himself as a lazy urban missionary, someone who saw the need to grow ministry sustainably without burnout. After navigating countless grant rejections early on, he learned what it really takes to get a yes. Over the past 7 years, Ken has helped 6 nonprofits secure over $1 million in funding, transforming volunteer run programs into organizations with paid part and full time staff. Ken holds a master's degree in nonprofit administration, serves as an associate pastor at the Meeting Place Church, and is a devoted husband to his wife Shelby and proud father of 4. His passion is helping mission driven leaders turn vision into strategy and strategy into impact. Welcome to the podcast, Ken.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joy. It's great to be on.
So, to start off, can you tell us about your current role and how you got started in ministry and in grant writing?
Yeah, so a little bit about what I do now. I am a freelance grant writer. I started a business about a year ago. After helping different organizations, I really feel a passion and a call to help faith-based nonprofits get the funding that they need so that they can impact the kingdom of God. Because while all of these different programs are great, if you're looking at other programs, they don't necessarily preach about the gospel, and that's really what matters in the end. About 9 years ago now, I moved to Cleveland as an urban missionary with the Assemblies of God. And so, as part of that role, I needed to do fundraising and do itineration by going to different churches around the state, around the nation. I thought that by sending letters and reaching out to people on email or social media, not really putting in the work, God would just send all the money my way. And that's not how it happened. As I was trying to raise my budget and all, I was like, oh, like we have these nonprofits here because our ministry, we have a church and then 2 nonprofits that are separate but associated with the church. And I was like, oh, I've heard of this thing called grants. I've heard that it's something that people get to help grow their organization. Back in college and in high school, I was always told I was a good writer. So let me try this out. It's got to be pretty easy. So then I go about doing it and I get a whole bunch of rejections, get no and no. After kind of getting over like the initial discouragement, I saw that if we can figure out how to turn those no's into yeses, there can be a lot of value in helping to grow our organization financially. So when we started this process, I'd realized that I have to learn more. So I decided to go back to school to get my master's degree. And as a result, I learned kind of the technical skills and then also continuing to just kind of know our funders in our area. When we started this process, our organization had about 3 or 4 people getting small stipends, essentially like, here's gas money to volunteer here. And we grew that to now having 9 paid staff members here. A lot of them live right in our community. And it's really been cool to kind of see that change and transformation. I can just say, first of all, thank God for that. But also, I think it's really helped me to figure out that this is kind of my calling to help not just our organization, but other organizations find the funding that they need so that they can make a greater impact.
Yeah. And when we first connected about this podcast, this is exactly the resource I've been looking for to share with my listeners because it's a question I get a lot and it's something that I personally don't have experience in. And I was thrilled to see your name pop up and go, oh, hey, this is somebody we can talk to. Like me, a lot of pastors might not be familiar with grants as a funding source. Some of us have been told that, hey, you should go apply for grants, but we don't really know about that. So could you explain what grants are and how they can complement kind of the more traditional church funding methods like tithes and offerings?
Yeah, so essentially, grants come from primarily 2 sources. They come from either or I guess 3 technically. They can come from foundations, which are private community 501c3s that their task is to hand out money to help further a cause. Another source would be corporate grants. So like different corporations like Target, Walmart, things like that. They always have like a foundation component where they usually will give out grant funding that way. And then also you have your state/federal, your governmental grants. And so essentially how a grant works is you are given a task to do. And so like, let's say your church has a food bank and you're giving out food every Tuesday evening to the community. Grants can help pay for things like that. And for me, I think that grants is probably one of the most underutilized resources by the church. And it's something where every church is doing something in the community. If they're not, they should be, where you're doing something that's not just your traditional Sunday morning or Wednesday evening type of services, where you're doing something that's reaching out to the community. And whatever that might be, there's probably a grant or two available for that. And that can help when it comes to your church funding. It can give you a little bit of additional funding. You have your funding for tithes and offerings to help with your church staff, any kind of supplies that you might need for your church. But having a grant can help with supplies that you use for outreach. Those that are running those type of programs need to be paid as well. And this can be a source that you can actually pay them with.
Yeah, and I know paying our staff is a tough thing for a lot of churches. And so having a way to be able to fund that would be a great resource. So what types of church initiatives or programs would typically be eligible for some kind of grant funding?
Typically anything that is kind of outside of the traditional church service type of thing. So any type of outreach that you're doing to the community. For example, when I started working in a nonprofit, we have an after-school program. That is something that there is a lot of funding for, especially here in Cleveland, because the education system in Cleveland is so challenging. There's a lot of grant funding associated with that. If you're doing something to help minister to senior adults, like let's say you have a group that goes to an assisted living facility or something like that, there's probably grant funding for there. Food pantry, I think, is a big one. Daycare, I know sometimes churches may charge for daycare services, but then you can also apply for voucher funding, and there's also grant funding on top of that. So there's a lot of things. I think basically the way I would describe it is anything that you're doing outside of the four walls of the church to reach the community. And I think it's also a great aspect because it can help bring in more people into your church because you have that connection and someone that you may not normally meet in just like as a pastor, you might meet as a leader of an after school program or a leader of whatever other organization you might do.
Right. And then also, even in the process of applying for grants, those are relationships you're building as well.
Absolutely.
So can you walk us through the basic process of finding and applying for grants that would be appropriate for churches and I know you talk about faith-based nonprofits, but especially the ones that would be affiliated with the church, since that's a lot of our audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with finding the grants because you could Google it, but it could be very overwhelming. And it can also be really hard to find what actually works and what wouldn't work. So I have 3 different ways that you can find grants. Number 1, Facebook's other organizations that are similar to yours. What I do is I follow a lot of like the after school programs that are similar to us in our area, because typically when someone gets a grant, they like to really shout out that foundation. And if they're shouting out that foundation, that's probably a foundation that might support you as well. So I like to do that
for the big check kind of thing.
Yeah. So you always want to kind of keep, like I like to just follow, because also you get ideas of social media and kind of some programming stuff, but especially for the grant aspect. Another thing you could do to find grants is talk to some of your community leaders. So if you have a community development corporation, if you go to your city council or your mayor and say like, this is what we're doing, they typically will know where the funding is, whether it's funding from like the city itself, whether it's funding from XYZ organization, they can kind of guide you there. But also there are a couple of softwares that you can use. 2 that I would recommend would be number 1, Instrumental, which is a paid service, but basically you type in what you're doing, type in where you are, and there's also a checkbox for whether or not you're faith-based, and it'll populate however many matches it can find based on what you give it. Another one that is available, it's also paid, but I'll give a workaround in a second. It's called the Foundation Center Online. It's basically the same thing. I call it like the Google of grants, where if you just type in after school program in Cleveland, Ohio, it'll give you everything that it's listed there. And it is paid, but there are a few ways that you can get it for free. The easiest way is a local library. A lot of libraries around the nation have the foundation directory online as part of their circulation desk. So you can just go up to them and ask them. But also, if you have a profile through Candid, which is a database for all nonprofits, a lot of foundations will look at your Candid profile to see, like, because you'll give information about how much you made last year, what kind of grants you got, what's your board makeup, what are your programs, things like that. If you answer enough questions to get a gold seal of approval, they'll give you Foundation Center for free. Okay. So it takes a little bit of work, but you can still get it for free. My recommendation is always to reach out to them, because even though a computer will tell you that it's a good match, sometimes going to them in person, you'll realize that it's not. I always recommend to try to reach out to them, tell them who you are, what you do, and what the process looks like to apply. Even though you can find it usually on their website, but that's usually a good indication of whether or not they'll actually fund you. So when you actually go to apply for the grant, every single grant application is different. There's a lot of similar elements to it, but my biggest thing is you always have to make sure that you're reading carefully. Just like it was in elementary school, where you always have to read the directions, because there are so many different little nuances that you could miss that could affect whether or not you get funded. But a lot of the basic areas, they'll ask about your organization as a whole. So like, what is the history of your organization? How are you doing what you're doing? What are some of the programs that you've done in the past? What are you doing now? What is like the short and long-term impact of that? And obviously they'll ask a lot about numbers, like how much you're asking for, how much your budget is. And then sometimes they'll ask for a specific budget, whether that's based on what they're paying for. So if you're asking for a grant for $10,000, they may ask you to break that down, like 5,000 is going to personnel, 4,000 is going to supplies, whatever. Sometimes they'll ask for like your overall operational budget. So that's kind of a general breakdown. Usually when you get the responses, you can kind of figure it out. Most of the questions are pretty straightforward, but it's the ones that aren't straightforward that usually sway yes or no.
Kind of a piggyback question on there. So say a church is thinking about starting an after school program. They want to, but they're not financially in a great place to do that yet. Can you apply for grants when you haven't actually launched something yet? Like you've got a business plan for it, but it's not actually out there, or does it have to be established?
I have gotten grants for startups.
Okay.
Typically foundations like to see a track record, but also if you've done other things in the past, I think that would be sufficient for somebody. And also if it's launching from the church and the church has like tithes and offerings coming in, even if it's not a lot, it still shows a little bit of sustainability, because one of the bigger things is like foundations love to give away money. They're required by law to do so, but they don't want to give it to organizations that they're concerned won't be able to stay long term. So if you have a budget that is separate from, if you have a church budget, you know that if worse comes to worse and you lose a little bit of finances on it, then like there's going to be a little bit more flexibility than if I were to just say, hey, I'm a new person out of nowhere starting a nonprofit and I've got nothing. So that's definitely an advantage for churches as opposed to just starting out.
Right. Churches can say, we've been around for a couple of years. You know, this is our track record so far, even if this particular initiative is a new thing for us.
Yeah.
We haven't disappeared yet. We haven't quit yet. You don't want to give your money to an organization that you don't know if they're going to be there.
Yeah. Which makes sense. Like if someone was asking me to donate something to them, I kind of get this weird feeling like, oh, wait, you're not really good with money, or I don't really know if you actually can do what you're saying you're doing.
I mean, if we are called as believers to be stewards and these foundation administrators are like stewards on an extra scale, they're literally their job to make sure that it's going to good stuff.
Yeah.
It's going to be well managed.
And that's all they do.
That's literally all they do all day. So what are some common misconceptions that pastors might have about grants for faith-based organizations?
I think one of the big misconceptions is that because you talk about Jesus that you can't get grant funding. And I think that's something that, because a lot of times they'll say on the application website, like, we don't give to religious organizations for religious purposes. So like a lot of people, when they read that, they're like, oh, well, I'm a church, I can't do it. Sometimes if you're applying as a church, they might automatically reject you depending on the foundation, which is why, like, if you're really looking to try to do this like big time, I would recommend establishing like a separate 501c3 or like a separate entity, just so that there's that separation there. Our first value on our after school programs website is that we are unapologetically faith-based. And so when foundations are looking us up and they're looking at our website, that is the first thing that they see. And yet they still give to us. So it is possible. When it says religious organizations for religious purposes, basically what they're saying is that they won't fund churches to run their Sunday morning service or any of like the church related activities. And the other big thing with talking about the gospel is they don't want anyone to be excluded from any of your programming based on their religious beliefs, which as a church, we should be trying to reach anybody. If a Muslim's coming into our doors, if an atheist is coming into our doors, if a Buddhist is coming into our doors, we want that because we want them to hear about Jesus and be loved on. So I think that's one of the bigger misconceptions. I think another one is that grants will completely save an organization because, like, let's say your program costs $20,000 to run. If you're asking for a grant for $20,000, a foundation's probably not going to fund it. Typically, they like to fund between 10 to 20% of the overall program budget. So, like, if you're going for grants, yes, go for them, but also have a mix of other things that you're going towards. If this is a program at your church, take time on Sunday morning and say, like, hey, this is what we're doing to help reach the community. This is how we are getting Jesus known right here in our backyard. So let's come alongside it. Last one I'll talk about is that grants is just kind of like a blank check. Typically, when you are applying for grants, you're telling them how you're spending their funding. And sometimes there's limits on what you can fund. Like, some will not fund for personnel. Some will only fund a certain amount for indirect costs, such as rent, utilities, things like that. Yes, it's great to have the check, but you also have to make sure that you know where it's going. In the financing world, or at least in the nonprofit world, the difference between restricted and unrestricted funding. Most grants are restricted funding. It's always nice, though, when they say, hey, you can use it however you want. But most of the time, it has to go for a specific project or for specific dollar amounts in different line items. So you just got to be careful of that.
So is that something, too, on the back end that you're needing to keep a record of how it was used?
Yeah. Sometimes they'll just ask you, did you use it the way that you said? Which also is nice because it provides a little bit of flexibility. But also sometimes they will ask you for like an exact dollar amount. I've had a couple grants where they actually ask you to send receipts. A lot of federal and state grants will also ask for more specific receipts. So like if, because sometimes those are more reimbursable grants. So like, let's say if you're paying for payroll, they'll ask for like the payroll receipt, something like that. But yeah, you'd want to at least track it so that you know where it's going. If you have QuickBooks or something like that, usually you can kind of set it up that way too.
Right. And then you know what those requirements are up front so that you're keeping what they need.
Because usually most grants are like a 12-month period. And then after that, usually like a month or two afterwards, they'll ask for like a report. And those reports can vary. Sometimes they'll just ask like, so what did you do? How many people did you serve? And that's it. But then sometimes it's like, how did you spend the money? And in those instances, you'll want to keep good track. So you definitely want to know ahead of time.
Yeah. So how can a church discern which initiatives might be a good candidate for grant funding versus which they should fund through your regular giving?
I think a big part of it would be, what is the biggest need in your area? Because that's typically where most grant funding will be. So if you're in an area that has a lot of needs for disabled people, then I would say go for grant funding in that area. If you're in an area with a lot of food insecurity, go with that. I think it all depends on kind of what is the biggest thing. For us, education is so huge. So there's a lot of foundations that focus just on education. Also, workforce development is a big one too. Also a little bit the arts, but it all depends on what the biggest thing is. Once again, I think it's just important to find something that is an outreach to your community. More than likely, there's going to be at least a couple grants available.
That the same areas that they're trying to address in their community would be the types of things you might look for grants.
Basically anything that they're like, that's really like passionate for them too. because also like not even just with grants, but also in just fundraising in general, something you're passionate about, you're gonna speak to that more, and that's gonna relate to people more.
People, we really have hard for this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are there any potential theological or ethical considerations pastors need to think through before they start pursuing grants?
I think one of the biggest ones would be where the money is coming from can sometimes be a little bit of an ethical dilemma, as well as sometimes foundations will fund other organizations that may go against your values and your beliefs. For us, we see it as it's really hard to track because even if it's not a foundation, there could be a lot of individuals that support our mission that don't necessarily agree with us and our values and our beliefs. But like if a foundation is supporting something that, let's say your church is very pro-life, but they're pro-choice and they're funding Planned Parenthood, that might be an ethical dilemma that you have to at least navigate through. Or like LGBTQ+, that could be something else that a pastor may just have to say, is this something that we're comfortable with? It might be something to bring up to the board, like, hey, we're pursuing this foundation. We're not supporting what they believe in. We're just trying to get funding from them. I think it's just something they may have to like navigate. There's also another thing, like in our city, we have a couple casinos. The city of Cleveland does casino grants. As part of that grant process, you have to have a resolution from your board that says that you're okay with it. Because I know sometimes for people that could be very icky to like take money that was originally gambled to then use as a grant.
Right. And it might not be a cut or dry thing of we don't love this organization, but there might be times where I'm thinking like sometimes like how are you going to be an influence in those organizations? And then some things are going to be like, no, we got to draw a line on this one. If there's a business out there that gives a scholarship and I don't agree with everything that business does, but they give a scholarship, and I'm like, give it the scholarship, right? But then there might be other things where I'm like, if they're a hard stance on something, because essentially when you say thank you for the grant money, you're also promoting that organization too.
Yeah. And especially like if it's something that you're okay with receiving the grant funding, but maybe you don't want to publicly thank them, maybe that's something that you can agree to as a board or as an organization. But it's important to at least keep that in mind. Like, there are nonprofits out there that probably are against what you actually believe in your values, and they probably get funding from the same people.
Are there situations where receiving a grant puts any kind of restrictions on you as the organization in terms of how you can operate your after school program, as an example?
Typically, no. I think when you receive a grant too, you usually get like terms and conditions. Like once I cash the check, I am agreeing to X, Y, and Z. But usually it's like kind of more standard things like I will spend all of the money properly.
Right.
I'm not going to use it in like an improper way. I'm not going to use it for terrorism. That's become a bigger one the last 10, 20 years. But usually you can still operate the same way. If it was an issue, they probably wouldn't fund you to start with. So they'll probably just reject you.
Could you share a success story of a church that was able to fund a really significant initiative through grants?
Yeah, so I shared a little bit about our after school program, but there is another organization I worked with. They were starting a workforce development nonprofit. They were helping young people get in the job force and give them training. They start out with nothing, and we're trying to get construction costs and everything like that. And as a result of grant funding, it gave them the push to get to a point where after the first full year of operation, they were actually operating in the black, which for a startup coffee shop, that's really hard to do.
Right.
So it really was as a result of grant funding that they were able to kind of take that first step. I always get excited when they do get grant funding. It's like, it's a win for everyone.
I was thinking too, I know some people that are at kind of smaller churches that do active things in the community, but they don't bring in a ton of tithe and offering because the church is just not that big, because it's a small town or whatever. And I would wonder if there might be funding for some of the things that they're already doing, that would enable them to then kind of use their tithe and offering to handle some of the other operational pieces.
Oh yeah, I think especially because like our church is pretty small. Mm-hmm. And also like we're in a very low income community. Like our median income is like $15,000. So like there are times where our offering plate is like $30. And and that's we're okay with that. That's also like why originally we came as missionaries. So then we wouldn't put a burden on the church finances to help fund what we're doing. But also it helps with our nonprofits. So then yes, technically I'm bivocational, but both of my vocations are still ministry.
Right. So if there's a pastor listening and they're interested in exploring grants, but they don't have any experience.
I think the first step would be ready to get rejected at first, because sometimes it could be really hard. And sometimes when you get the no, the initial feeling is like, oh my gosh, like, what did I do wrong? Why do they hate me? They must hate Jesus. Like, this is like the devil talking. No, sometimes it's just they want to see if you're actually serious about it. And some foundations will reject organizations right away, regardless of like conversations or anything like that. So just have the mindset of endurance, that this is a long game, not a short game. But then also, there's a lot of trainings that you can do, whether it's online. The Foundation Center, also known as Candid, they usually will do grant writing training several times throughout the year. Sometimes it's free, sometimes it's paid, depending on how intense it is. Also, I would reach out to a grant writer that you trust and a grant writer that knows their stuff. Being able to apply for a grant is one thing. Being able to get funded is totally something different. So you always just want to be careful there.
Yeah. You mentioned some things I want to circle back. So if you get rejected for a grant, should you keep applying the next time it's available?
Yeah, unless they say otherwise, because there are some that say don't apply until like another year, but most of them they'll just apply, keep applying again. And when you get rejected, reach out to that foundation and ask for feedback. Typically, they will be pretty generous and they'll be gracious, because they still like their goal is to give away money. They don't want to not give away funding, but there are hard choices that they have to make. And if you can improve the quality of your grant, if you could reach out and be like, hey, like, where did I go wrong here? They'll usually tell you, well, this was confusing, or you didn't follow the way that we wanted to here, or I didn't understand your budget, whatever it might be. So yeah, I would just continue to apply.
What are some of the common mistakes that churches make when they're applying for grants?
I think one of them is not being clear on what your mission is and like what the purpose of the grant is going towards. So like, let's say you're starting an after school program, make sure that it's focused on the after school program and nothing else. Another big mistake is as you're writing the grant, don't make it about yourself, make it about the impact and make it about the foundation. Every foundation has their fun buzzwords, just like any church has their phrase. Like I remember seeing recently a social media trend where they said like, say something that your pastor might say. So yeah, like something like that. Like you want to say things the way that that foundation would say, because if you say that, they'll be like, okay, they did their research. They know that they're a fit. Don't make it necessarily about what you are providing, except for this is the overall impact that we're going to make because of the funding that you are going to give us.
Awesome. Well, as we get ready to wrap up here, thank you so much for this super practical, useful information. Like I said, like churches need to know this, pastors need this information. So where can our listeners connect with you and learn more about your own faith-based grant writing business and what you're doing?
Yeah, so the best way to probably reach out to me would be email, nonprofitmissionary@gmail.com. I am on social media at Nonprofit Missionary, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. So that's something, if you want to reach out to me there, I have some content just about general practicalities with grants and kind of how to structure nonprofits and things like that. So yeah, definitely reach out there, Nonprofit Missionary.
Wonderful. And I'll make sure to drop that in the show notes as well. Thank you so much, Ken, for your time today. Was there any kind of final word that you would want to give to our pastors and leaders listening to this?
I would just say, don't give up. What you're doing is so important to our community, and not just for the community, but for the kingdom of God. And I know it's hard to find funding, but I know what it looks like on the other side. So keep going.